First, I want to introduce Evan LaPointe. Evan is an entrepreneur who built a groundbreaking new tag management platform and sold it to Adobe. And he lived out in Salt Lake at Adobe's headquarters for 3 years. He's back now in Atlanta, and he has a new project that he's working on called Core. So it's all about innovation. So he's going to come up and talk about that. So please help me welcome Evan LaPointe.
All right, is this working? Yes? Okay. Bear with me because I'm mentally rewriting the talk in my mind so we can go faster. Because right after me are two of my favorite things in the whole world, cars and food. So I'll break this up into 3 pieces. The first piece is a couple stories about how innovation's kind of played a role in my life. The second piece is a set of tools that I have found extremely useful in helping myself, my teams, and other companies think about innovation. And as this third part is how we can apply those tools as an example so that they are not just stuff, conversations. So a while ago, I would say back in 2005 or 6, I transitioned actually out of doing what Dr. Dan, which is so fun to say Dr. Dan, I transitioned out of what he did. I used to be a quantitative analyst. I used to do independent research on publicly traded companies and do valuations. So DCF did a lot of that kind of work. Glad I escaped a long time ago and moved into digital marketing because you can invent new things there. You can't invent new things except for Dr. Dan in finance, because people would tell you, hey, that's a really cute idea. Adam Smith came up with that a little while ago. That got old. So went into digital marketing. I was an analyst. I worked on marketing campaigns. I was more interested in the site experience. On-site was more the topic at the time. Now, of course, you got mobile. And in doing that, after a few years, I saw a pretty clear need. One was, and it actually broke down into 2 needs. One was very tactical in that the implementation of data gathering technologies on our websites is a pain in the ass. Raise your hand if you agree. It used to be a pain in the ass because I invented something. I guess that's why so few people raise their hand. But the 2 needs were, because it was so hard to get tags on our websites to monitor all the behavior and see what people were doing, who was converting, who was doing things that kind of went before conversion that would suggest they're becoming more likely to convert. That was really, really difficult. It would take hundreds, if not thousands of hours for companies to do that implementation work. And because it was taking so much time to do the basic work, people weren't actually measuring more nuanced things that were going on in the experience. They were measuring yes or no whether people bought, but they weren't measuring all these little activities that people do within the interfaces of products and depends on the industry, et cetera. But there's a lot of nuanced data that kind of suggests whether the propensity is going up or down for that purchase downstream. So one of the things that you encounter when you think about inventing something or innovating in an area is a lot of encouragement. And it comes in the form of people saying, if this was worth doing, somebody would have already done it. Or if this was easy to figure out, somebody much smarter than you would have already figured it out. So a lot of people are really very supportive of new ideas when you bring them up. And we find this culturally in companies, right? If you find companies saying this about things large or small, that is not a source of innovation. And that's a major cultural problem. We'll talk about that in a minute. So we ignored all that, and we made a tool called Satellite. We brought it to market. Our first customer was here in Atlanta. It was a camera retail company. They do a lot of buying and selling of used camera equipment. And we knew they were the ideal customer for us because they never asked, have you ever tried this before? So when we didn't have to answer that question, we went ahead and landed that sale. And it was very successful. And that led us to customer 2, which was Chick-fil-A. They were relaunching their website back in 2010, 2011. And we cut about 90%, 95% of the development hours that they were going to spend putting this technology onto their website. And it cut about 250 hours out of their launch timeline of the site. The first customer, we sold a lifetime license. For $2,500, you could have the software forever. For Chick-fil-A, we sold it for $12,500 for a lifetime license. And by customer 7, we were up to $100,000, $150,000 a year software as a service license. Customer 7 was our first European customer, so now we knew we had 2 new things that were really cool. 1, we were international, and 2, if there was ever a bug, I had to wake up at 2 a.m. and fix it. That was, you give and take. But it was very cool to see something that was literally made at my dining room table have an international customer. And today, after Adobe's purchased it, over 4,000 brands have this implemented on their website. It's the 4th largest behavioral measurement technology on the entire internet, behind 2 things Google made and one other thing Adobe made called Adobe Analytics, which some of you might use. So the product today is called Dynamic Tag Management. Is it on any of your websites? Launch, DTM? Some half hand raise? Cool. So that's the product, and it's done very well. It's on over 80,000 websites. It's pretty cool. You can install a little toolbar extension and see if it's on it. You can play with the tool if you want, and it's cool to kind of go around the sites I see every day and see this little upstart all over the internet. And my mom really still doesn't understand any of it, but probably one of the coolest things is this is a picture about 4 years ago. I was in London. This is a picture of about a third of a training room. That's my colleague Jeff Chasen up there doing a training for about 250 people who came to London from all over Europe during Adobe Summit to be trained on the technology. And to stand in the back of a room and see that happening from something that you poured your life into is just incredible. And we really knew we made it when we were in the Facebook help section for how to install their technology through ours. But just kind of funny and humbling to kind of go around and see this stuff. And that's a story kind of about creating something out of nothing, which is how a lot of people think about innovation. Innovation as invention, which I think is actually a huge mistake. So I want to take it a completely different way and talk about after I got to Adobe, what innovation looked like there. And I've replaced some of the things in these graphics so that it's not the IP of Adobe here. But at Adobe, we had this situation on our hands that Adobe had acquired 33 different businesses, 33 different products, and is weaving that together into these solutions that are offered in the Marketing Cloud, what's now called the Experience Cloud. These software solutions are all made up of pieces of things. They're all made up of technical pieces. And if you actually stack all the pieces next to each other, you'll realize that some of them are actually common. We have this common edge that sits basically as a service when data comes through kind of the exterior wall of Adobe into the interior. That's common across all the platforms. Data storage is common across all the platforms. Algorithms and alerts and anomaly detection, machine learning, et cetera, all common across these platforms. So what we did is we went through a project, instead of building something out of nothing, we went through a project of let's turn something into something better. And we were able to take 600 plus components across these 30 applications and distill it down to 21 technical components that can be used in varying combinations to build the functionality of every single piece of technical architecture in the Adobe Marketing Cloud. So this is what I think is much more applicable in most businesses today. How do we take the super shitty stuff that we have right now and turn it into stuff that's awesome and ready for the future? Because it's great to kind of create an innovation lab and start some new products, but we are bandwidth constrained in our companies. And I believe that 75% plus of our bandwidth constraints, which means when we walk into work, how much free time do we have to actually have a thought? We are bandwidth constrained because of all the duct tape, baling wire, and mess that we've kind of cobbled together with short-term solutions and haven't really addressed some of these underlying architectural or procedural things in the company. We have to get better at companies at releasing the bandwidth constraints, and that comes from kind of rejuvenating and innovating in things that already exist. And what's cool about this is these 21 ingredients can also be combined to create net new things. So Adobe doesn't have to buy new companies to do new things. They can just use these components in different ways. So it's kind of a cool project. So we had to answer, abstract and unusual questions like, what is a decision? When you're building software, you have to kind of ask questions that seem silly, but you build technical architecture. So you find yourself jumping around lots of different things. And where that transitions from story time to tool time is in defining innovation usefully. And I think most of the popular way we talk about innovation, when you read about it or when people kind of jabber about it on the TV or whatever, is they talk about it in the terms of the output of innovation. And it's kind of like talking about creativity in terms of its output. It's too prolific. There's too many different types of creative output. There's too many different types of creative or innovative, output. It's much more useful to think about innovation as a mindset as opposed to an output. And that leads me to 3 tools out of many that we work with businesses on, but I think these are really interesting and useful. So if you talk to a psychologist, an actual scientist, about decisions. They're going to say decisions kind of follow this flow of see, think, act. And innovators are extraordinarily good, or companies that are behaving well as innovators, so teams, et cetera. It doesn't just have to be a person. It can be all sorts of different things. They're extraordinarily good at these three things, and companies that struggle are often extraordinarily terrible at these three things. So we'll start with C. The tool of C, I think this is a really cool quote. Talent hits targets no one else can hit. Genius hits targets no one else can see. It brings the concept of genius kind of within reach to non-extraordinary IQ people to say, if we in a competitive market can see things, can see targets that our competitors are unable to see, that's a tremendous advantage, a huge advantage. If we in our own company can evaluate ourselves with a lot of clarity and see things that no one else can see, we have the chance to evolve ourselves and become a much better company. So seeing is super important. And seeing is actually what Dr. Dan was talking about. I'm going to say that as often as I possibly can. And you've earned it. But what he was talking about is financial analysts only see these little dots. They only see two things in a sea of information. They only see, hey, I'm going to look at revenue, I'm going to look at cost of capital, I'm going to look at a few things in the DCF model, and that's what my whole worldview is going to be based on. And in the workplace, we often blind ourselves due to a couple different things, namely the goals that we have as individuals in our roles or in our departments or as a whole company. And when we have goals, as information flows into our minds and into our lives, we tend to listen to things that seem relevant, and we tend to not listen to things that seem irrelevant. And oftentimes, the things that are most relevant may feel irrelevant given the goals that we're focused on that day. So this is what's kind of cool, is as an organization, I recommend that every organization at least once a year stops looking just at the information and observes the filter itself that is combing the information that's coming through the organization. Great example of this is Microsoft under Steve Ballmer. Missed cloud, missed mobile, missed. That's because the filter that was in place in the psyche of the organization, both psychologically, the people they were hiring, very pragmatic thinkers, let's stay focused on what's right in front of us, but also the culture of the company and the goals of the company imposed a filter over the view of all the inbound information to that company, and the filter itself was the single most destructive aspect through those years. So sometimes the lens that distorts the view is actually more important to analyze than the view itself. And this is a tool because often in your own business, you can ask that question in a meeting or in the middle of a decision-making process. Are we looking at this? Are we seeing everything we need to see to make this decision? From a psychological perspective, this is very applicable when you're building experiences. When you lack any person in the room helping you make a decision who empathizes with the customer. You know, if you're thinking only internally and about your goals, and you've got this person who's like constantly wanting to hug all the customers, and you're just so tired of listening to them, if you refuse to receive the input that that person has, the data that they're bringing, saying, let me tell you what this feels like on the other side, you know, on the receiving end of this decision, if you don't acknowledge that information, your filter's blocking it out, then your culture itself is broken, and you're not getting critical information for the decision-making process. So invoke this idea in conversation, and it's useful. The next piece is about thinking. After we see, we got to do something with that information. You can think reactively, which means, or you can have a reactive process, which means you go right from see to act. We do that a lot in business. It's like we see a snake and jump out of the way. We see a piece of information, we triage that information, we act very quickly. The second model of thinking is kind of a sequential or cascading model of thinking. We say, would this idea work? No. Would this idea work? No. Would this idea work? Yes. Let's go with that. The problem with that is if you kept thinking for a little while, you'd probably come up with a much better idea. If you're playing chess using this sequential thought pattern, you're going to make a lot of really stupid moves. And if you're doing business using that, it's also going to result in a lot of bad moves. If you're choosing where to go to lunch, that's probably an okay model to employ. So what we recommend is a concept you've probably heard of. It's called diamond-shaped thinking, which is a distinct time frame for determining the things we could do, followed by a distinct time frame of determining what we should do. And what you'll find in this paradigm is that your should will not be a choice out of one of your coulds. It will actually be a hybrid of the best parts of many coulds. And that means it's critical during the thinking phase, this could-do phase, to not judge the options as they come out of people's mouths. It's not an episode of Shark Tank. Not idea has to be perfect, every single word in sequence. Ideas are very fragile, and we have to nurture them and not say things like, if it was simple, somebody would have already figured it out. That's very counterproductive. It's just this tool. Diamond-shaped thinking will always outperform the other forms of thinking. It is slower, so be aware of the fact that it's slower. But again, think about how much our bandwidth has been consumed by making decisions too quickly in the past. We're just kind of perpetuating that problem if we don't start transitioning more and more decisions to this style of thinking. The last thing is ACT. This is kind of like, I think a physical store is a great example. That before we open the store, we're going to try to figure out where we should stock all the products, where we should put the shelves. And then when we open the store, we're going to learn whether the way we set that store up works or not. And it's the same thing with practically every decision we make and everything we do. And this is why we talk about this kind of W-shaped cycle of action, which is basically saying, let's commit to something. Let's actually open the store and let's commit to some organization. But at some period of time, let's put the periscope up and actually get some awareness of what's going on here. And let's not get all mad at ourselves for making a few mistakes. It's not that productive to introduce lots of emotion into the process of learning what's going well and what's not going well. It's a lot more productive to say, we planned on some things maybe being wrong. Now we're at the period of time where we're going to look at that, we're going to make some changes, and then we're going to dive back down into the execution before, and if this is like a marketing campaign, before we come back out at the end of the campaign and try to learn something that could be useful, more generally speaking. Mike Tyson had a great quote on this topic: everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. There are several people, very smart people in different categories. There's an old Prussian general from the 1800s who said, all great plans fail upon first contact with the enemy. So this is a very real phenomenon. Plans don't work. They're great to have. You need to plan. You need to think. But you also need to build into your plan getting punched in the face, and then what are we going to do? So plan for that. So let's apply this construct to marketing. So first, we'll start with seeing. And I'm going to use what psychologists call the big 5 traits. I'm going to use 4 of the big 5 traits. You probably thought about Myers-Briggs and different things. But the big 5 traits are really interesting as opposed to segmentation techniques more normally used in marketing, because these represent informational needs of the consumer. So if somebody's high in neuroticism, they care a lot about risk, they're going to need a specific kind of message that addresses them and their informational needs. If you've ever done any selling in your life, you kind of intuitively feel out what type of person you're working with. If they're high in openness, well, forget about all the bullets. Let's clear the table. Let's start whiteboarding. Let's start thinking about creative ideas. The informational needs of your customers vary based on their psychological preferences. And if we're seeing clearly, we will see very much that we have different types of people coming to our websites, coming through our marketing, et cetera, coming into our stores. We will also see that they're at some part of the process. So again, we're still in the seeing phase of seeing the market. What's the truth of the market? I've oversimplified this into a simple kind of funnel, building awareness. They go through some research phase, and then finally they make some sort of a purchase. It's probably a lot more complicated than that for you, but this is a useful model. And what we don't see when we're seeing clearly is anything that closely resembles an average customer. There's no such thing as an average customer. In my whole career in analytics, I've never found one. There's no person that has your average conversion rate. There's no person that has your average number of sessions. There's no person that has your average time on site. There's no person that has your average click-through rate. None of them. But there are groups of people. And if you start segmenting and showing all of your data inside the organization and saying, maybe our average conversion rate is 3%, but for the 3 populations we care most about, it's 13% for population 1, it's 7% for population 2, and it's 0.1% for population 3. Does that seem more actionable? Yes. So stop talking about averages, please, for the love of God. I'm not going to follow up with anybody. I'm going to take it on trust. But averages do not exist, so please don't talk about them anymore. Now let's go through the thinking phase. What could we do? What should we do? We've seen our customer base. This is the reality of the market, and what this represents is 24 boxes for the marketing message that is relevant to the person who has this mindset, who is in this phase, and the experience that we could offer that person after that message connects with them in some way. Supposing we have some sort of a click that goes to an experience, we want to provide them something. Somebody with high neuroticism in the research phase will have certain messages that resonate better with them. And what you want to do is actually hybridize them. So you want to have one message that will address multiple different kinds of people without alienating as many people as possible. And then you enter the W-shaped cycle of action, and when you put the periscope up, you ask yourself what's going well, what's going poorly. Nobody gets fired yet. We're just trying to open the store, and it turns out we really stink for these people who are high in agreeableness and these people who are high in conscientiousness. We don't have messages that make sense for them. We don't have experiences that connect with their informational needs and move them through the funnel. Let's change that. It's actionable. Let's go write new things, create new things, design new things to address those people better. And as we get better at each of these little boxes, each of these stages, and again, this is an abstraction. In your own business, this will look a little different, and you don't have to do all 24 boxes on day one. You can start with 2 that generalize across this population and then expand to 6 or 8 as you see it working. But that's what productivity in this thought model kind of looks like. So that's an example of kind of how the tools lock into place on marketing as an example. Marketing is part of a much broader set of things that kind of combine into what a customer would tell you back is the customer experience that they go through. And we teach businesses how to become innovative in lots of different areas and lots of different ways, namely culturally. And we can see that the tools we talked about, our friends at Drum, for example, have a very high capability in these areas. That's why they succeed the way they do. And we think that every business needs to invest in themselves, becoming innovative, culturally adept at these types of tools, et cetera. So that's all I've got for you today. Thank you very much.